November. So I've been here almost 2 years now. And before that, I was a director of federal fiscal monitoring with the Texas Education Agency. So I have about 30 years of experience working with federal grants with either federal, state, or nonprofits. So that's just a little bit of my background. So I do have a lot of experience working with the federal grants, and I've seen a lot of the changes throughout these 30 years, how they have been treated, or how their requirements or compliance requirements have changed. So let's dive into it. Before we get into the time and effort, some basic federal grant fund expenditures requirement. As you all know, to spend the federal funds, all the costs has to be reasonable, necessary, and allocable. You will hear a lot about allocability throughout this presentation, because that's how the government likes to see, because federal funds are basically supplemental funds. So a lot of the funds that they come are on top of the regular grants that folks receive. So they are really interested in knowing, how did you allocate that cost specifically to reach the objectives of the federal grants? So that's why allocability is extremely important when it comes to spending the federal funds. Um, it has to comply with the cost principle 2 CFR 200, and specifically for the federal award. There are different requirements sometimes for different federal awards. So a requirement that's good for one federal grant may not be good for the second federal grant that you may have. It has to be consistent with the policies and procedures applied uniformly to federal and non-federal activities and costs. You cannot have different policy when you're spending the money for your state or local funds versus the federal funds. If you have to treat the cost exactly same the way you would treat all the expenditures. So you can't have different policies. You're paying something more from one from state funding versus less or more from a federal fund. So it has to be consistent. With the federal funds or any accounting, it has to be adequately documented. If you don't have the documentation, it didn't happen. So it's really important that everything, whether it's payroll or non-payroll expenses, they must be adequately documented. And they should be incurred during the approved budget period. All the grants, they have their grant period, and the money that's given out or is passed through is supposed to be used during that budget period. So those are some of the basic requirements for spending the federal funds. Now let's look at the time and effort requirements. So the requirements of time and effort. I've seen the requirements for time and effort change for a long time. Before the 2 CFR 200 came along, there were several circulars, and the time and effort requirements were a little bit different in each circular, some for nonprofits, some for the school districts. So there were different circulars for different type of entities. But the one thing about these circulars, they were more specific. It asks you to provide certain type of documentation, whether it be personal activity report or semi-annual certifications. So they were more specific. They were also specific on when to prepare these time and effort reports. Whether if the activity report was asked, then you needed to complete it on a monthly basis. If the periodic certifications were asked, you were supposed to complete that within the 6 months. But when the new 2 CFR 200 came out, it basically put a lot of emphasis on the internal controls. The grantee is now more responsible to show that how they were able to allocate the cost, the payroll costs, to the appropriate funding source. So the burden of proof basically is now on grantee, because it doesn't give you a lot of specifics about what documents the grantee needs to show in order to comply with these requirements. Now, unfortunately, the basic requirement that you have to show how the cost is allocated based on the work performed for grant has not changed. What has changed is the more, like you said, the specifics about what forms to use, when to use. Those are the things that are missing. And I guess when the federal government decided to put kind of emphasis on the internal control, it kind of gives more latitudes to grantees to come up with their own type of forms and work papers that they can satisfy the auditors. So as long as you have a documentation that you could show how you were able to allocate the work performed for the grant, and that's acceptable to, if it meets all the requirements, then it's good to go. So, but as far as the typical requirements for time and effort, all salaries and wages charged to the federal award must be based on the records that accurately reflect the work performed as part of employees' employment obligation. So, as I was suggesting, that this is the basic requirement. If any employee is working on the federal grant, then they need to somehow show that their work actually reflected that they performed the work on the grant. It should be supported by a system of internal controls which provides reasonable assurance that the charges are accurate, allowable, and allocable. Remember the word allocable. The allocable ability is the most important thing in the time and effort. And of course, it has to be part of your official records. You should always have it in your policies and procedures, all the records that you're going to use. Now, of course, in the old days, we all used to have paper, certifications and paper records, but nowadays, a lot of these time and efforts have gone electronic. But as long as they are part of your official records, they should be included in that. The time and effort is not a 40-hour work week. If you work 60 hours, 70 hours, it's looked at it as a total activity. So if you work 40 hours and if you work 20 hours for the particular program, then that's 50% of the time that you spent on that program. If you work 60 hours on the program and you only work 20 hours of the program, then you basically work 1/3 on that program. So it's not a 40-hour work week, it's the 100% of your time that you spent, and then it's divided how much of that time you spent on that particular grant. So, from whom should the time and effort be collected? So, all the employees whose salaries are paid in whole or in part by the federal funds. Anyone getting paid with the federal funds needs to have time and effort. Whether it's in the combination, whether it's this 100% federal award or paid in combination of federal award or other federal, state, or local funding sources, as long as they're getting a part of the federal funds, they should be doing time and effort. Some of the grants have cost sharing requirements. So if you have that money coming in combined with the federal grant, then they also need to make sure that they have time and effort for those records. It includes all the full-time and part-time employees. Even if the part-time employee is getting some federal funds, they need to maintain time and effort. Some grants allow incentives. So if you are allowed to pay incentives, they are considered as a compensation expenses. So therefore, there should be a time and effort for those compensation. Now, you might say, well, where's the time if they are just getting incentives? Well, we have a whole couple of slides that talks about how you need to maintain the time effort for any type of incentives. They need to be part of your established policies and procedures. Once again, 2 CFR 200 is very big on the internal controls, and internal controls start with your accounting policies and procedures. So they should be part of your accounting policies and procedures, and we'll talk a little bit more about those later on. They should be able to support distribution among specific activities or cost objectives. When you have multiple funding sources, paying for an employee's salary, then that employee should be able to support the distribution of all specific activities that they carried out for that particular grant or different set of grants. Internal controls. So what are the internal controls? As we talked about it, that this is a really important part of the integral part of maintaining the time and effort. The number one thing is you have to have really good policies and procedures, and not just preparing the policies and procedures, but you need to make sure that you are enforcing those policies and procedures. And that should include basically all types of documentation that the employee is supposed to. Mark, you're muted. I'm sorry. Are you trying to say something? Sorry. You're still muted, Mark.
Sorry, Roger. They were asking me a question here.
Okay,
They're
sorry.
starting to do something,
Okay,
but no, go ahead. Sorry.
okay, yeah. So, yeah, as I mentioned, the time and effort begins with having a really good policies and procedures, and that should include all the instructions that the employee should be able to follow. Once you have really good policies and procedures, you should provide the training to for on time and effort reporting, because sometimes it's if you have an electronic system, or if you're using some kind of a legend to report your project work or activities, then they need to be communicated to staff that this is how they need to prepare their activity report or certifications. I know I get great training from my boss, and when I was a supervisor, I made sure that the staff who were supposed to maintain their time and effort had really good training. Um, because here's the deal, if you have incorrect time and effort reported, that can translate into incorrect payroll costs. So it is really important that everyone understands that they are supposed to, how they are supposed to maintain the time and effort. And I think the staff should be encouraged to ask more questions, because this is something that can eventually affect the payroll costs. And if it's not done correctly, then that could become a question cost by the federal, like I said, it can become a question cost that needs to be paid back. So it's really important that everybody understands how the reporting should be done. Once you have provided the training, then somebody needs to really look at it to make sure that the time and effort reports are completed on a timely basis, and make sure that they are accurate. And I always recommend, even though, as I said, the new CFR 200 does not require a supervisor to sign off on any of the time and efforts documentation reported by the employee, it is always a good idea to have someone else approve their time and effort. So that way there are two people looking at the time and effort. And if there are mistakes in the time and effort, which I've seen, I personally have done mistakes that my supervisor say, well, you should be putting, you worked on this project on this much, so you should be putting that instead of that much. So it's really important that someone else is looking at your time and effort. Of course, what's time and effort if it's not reconciled with the payroll cost? So it's really, really crucial that it's reconciled, because you're maintaining time and effort to make sure that you're paid according to that time that's reported. But once you budgeted the time and effort, once you budgeted the payroll cost, and if you're not reconciling that payroll cost with the time and effort, then it defeats the whole purpose of maintaining the time and effort. So these are the main responsibilities that the grantee needs to kind of, make sure that they are done. So to have a really good, successful implementation of time and effort reporting. I want to talk a little bit about job descriptions, and job descriptions are really, really important when reporting time and effort. And as we go through this presentation, you will understand why they are so important, how they are specifically related to the time and effort. So when should the job description be reviewed and updated? I know we ask for job description upfront for many of our grants, but again, these grants sometimes, they run 2 3 years. So it's really important that they need to that the job descriptions are reviewed annually as part of the annual performance review process, to ensure that the job descriptions accurately reflect the current duties and responsibilities. I've seen job descriptions of folks who are on a completely different job duties, and that's what their job description is, and they are reporting time and effort. When I look at their job description, there is nothing in their job description that matches their time and effort records. So I think it's a good idea to look at them annually, or when their job duties change. Whenever there is a significant change in the responsibilities, task, or require skill for a position, I think their job descriptions need to change. I really like job description signed by the employee and approved by the supervisor. That way, the employees knows exactly what they're supposed to be working on. And if the duties change, then their job description should be updated. Now, sometimes the funding will change, if the funding ends, or if the funding goes down, or if somebody's position is funded differently, in that case, their job description should be updated to reflect the new responsibilities tied to those specific funds, or the grant activities they need to carry out for that particular fund. So it's definitely, anytime the funding sources change, the employees now not getting paid for whatever the funding they were getting paid from the previous funding sources, then that also needs to be definitely changed. Sometimes this happens rarely, but the compliance requirement change. If the compliance requirement change, which means that they need to be updated in which means that the updates in the compliance regulation that affect the position, their job description should be updated to align the new requirements. So that can happen. So as I mentioned it earlier, job descriptions play a very crucial role in not only employee knowing what their responsibilities are, what they are supposed to be doing, but also help in supporting the time and effort. So here comes the allocable cost again. As I mentioned it earlier, federal funds are all about allocability, whether it's the payroll cost or the non-payroll cost, they're always looking for allocability of the cost. And we are going to have this afternoon a full session on the cost allocation. And many of you who have worked on the budgets and all that know how the cost allocation works. So it's also as important as it is for the non-payroll, is important for a federal award to have a cost allocation as far as the time and effort is concerned. So by definition, a cost is cost allocation cost is a cost allocable when goods and services are chargeable or assignable to the federal award or a cost objective. We'll go a little bit over about the cost objective in accordance with the relative benefits received. So just because somebody's getting paid out of certain percentages, it's how much benefits are that the program is getting received. That's what the whole importance is here for the cost allocation. The standards are met if the cost is incurred specifically for the federal award, which is pretty simple. If somebody's getting specifically some taking care of some of the objectives of the award, then that's meeting the requirement. It benefits both the federal award and the other work of non-federal entity and can be distributed in proportion that may be approximating using the reasonable method. So remember, I was telling you that in the old CFR or old circulars, they had specific forms, they had specific timelines. The new CFR is telling us that you come up with a reasonable method that can give us an assurance that you are able to show how the cost is allocable. So that's where that comes in from. Is necessary to the overall operation of the non-federal entity and is assignable in part to the federal award in accordance with the principle of that subpart. Is the cost meeting the program objective, the intent and purpose of the program? If it is not, then it's not allocable to the cost. Just because spending the money on certain thing doesn't mean, but if it's not meeting the objective, it's not meeting the intent of the program, then you cannot really allocate the cost to the program. So the time and effort is basically divided into two parts, when it comes to the reporting. Um, they're either based on they are based on the cost objectives, basically, either on the single cost objective or multiple cost objective. So what is a single cost objective? When an employee is paid 100% from grant funds or is working on the project where the employee's salary and wages can be fully supported by each of the federal award from which the employee is paid. It's very simple. When somebody is getting 100% of their money from single grant, that's a simple part. However, in certain cases, when the employee is getting funding from two separate funding sources, but all the activities that employee is carrying out is eligible from either of those two funding sources, that still becomes a single cost objective. For the most part, we don't see that a lot, at least not with the Hour Grant. So either your employees are 100% paid, or if they are split funded, when they are split funded with the different grants, that's where the multiple cost objective comes in. This is when an employee is working on a multiple cost objectives or multiple activities that cannot be defined as a single cost objective, which means that each funding source has its own objectives and it cannot be paid for another funding source. In most instances, the split funded employees paid with a combination of grant funds and other federal or non-federal funds are working on multiple cost objectives. Like I said, 99% of the employees, or at least 95% of the employees, are split funded, at least on the grants that I monitor. And most of those have multiple cost objectives. So they need to prepare a time and effort based on the multiple cost objective and not as a single cost objective. But we will go over the time and effort reporting of the both type of cost objective. So the single cost objective is very simple. It just requires a certification by an employee working on a grant or by a supervisor with the first-hand knowledge of the work performed confirms that the employee works solely on the activities related to a specific federal program or cost objective for a specified period of time. So if an employee worked on this particular grant, say for 6 months, then all they need to do is come back after the 6 months and sign a certificate or prepare a certificate that basically certifying that I worked 100% on this program from this period to that period. That will take care of their time and effort requirements. So again, it can be signed by an employee or their supervisor. I would prefer that it is signed by signed by the employee and then also signed by the supervisor. That way it confirms that the activities carried out by the employee met the program objective. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this CFR does not tell you when you should be preparing these certifications, as long as it's within the grant period. As far as the single cost objective or the certification, what we call as periodic certification or semi-annual certifications, I recommend that they be completed at least semi-annually, because it's basically should be in your policies and procedure when you intend your employees to complete these certifications. You don't want to wait till the auditor comes in and says, where are your semi-annual certification? Then you would have to, they'll look at your policies and procedures, because it should be spelled out in your policies and procedures specific to time and effort, that when employees are required to complete their periodic certification. I've seen some doing on a monthly basis, some on a quarterly basis, and some also on a semi-annual basis. The idea behind is that once you complete that work after a certain period of time, you certify that I worked 100% of my time was spent on the activities on this particular grant. So I think it's really important that you have that guideline set in your policies and procedures for employees to know when they need to complete their certification. A good job description outlining all activities performed by an employee should be there to support the cost objective. Here's the deal. I go in there and I see a certification that the employee says, I work 100% of my time on this particular grant. I need to know what did they do for the grant. And this is where the good job description, which is updated on the record, can show me that all the activities on their job description support are eligible to be funded by the particular grant. So it kind of supports your semi-annual certification. Now, you will not see that in 2 CFR 200 that you are required to have a job description to support the time and effort, but it is a good idea. Like I said, it creates a kind of a trail. It creates a kind of a combination of good job description, a certificate, tells the auditors that yes, these are all the activities that the employee was supposed to perform. The employee is certifying that I work 100% of my time on this grant, and that takes care of the time and effort part of the single cost objective. Now let's talk about multiple cost objective. As I mentioned earlier, most of the employees who are split funded will fall under the multiple cost objective. So the employee must keep a detailed record of their time spent on each grant or cost objective. This is usually done through a timesheet or a time log that breaks down the hours worked by the project or activity. Because these are multiple funding sources, you're working different activities for these funding sources. You have to show that you're allocating the time you spent on each of these federal funding sources. But it has to account for all of your activities. You can't just show, I work 20 hours on this federal funding sources and not account for the rest of the time that you work on different funding sources. So it needs to be for the complete, whether it's the federal or not federal activities, because again, you are at the end of the day, your payroll cost is based on the percentage of time you spent on each federal funding source. So it's really important that you have a full, whatever your work schedule is, that you're reporting all of your hours, whether you worked on the federal funding or not, that needs to be incorporated in your time and effort records. Employees should submit their time and effort reports regularly, typically on a monthly basis to coincide with one or more of the pay period. This ensures the records are up to date and accurate. If you are showing your time based on a project or based on a activity, then it's really important that at the end of the month, whatever time you spent on each project or activity is calculated at the end of the month so it can reflect on your payroll records. And I'll give you some examples later on. But if you don't do this on a monthly basis, like if you don't report your time, like I'm required to report my time and effort on a daily basis on which project I'm working on, how many hours am I working on. That way, at the end of the month, when you add it up, it will give me the percentages of the time I spent on a particular funding source. So then my payroll record should reflect exactly what the time I spent on it. Oops. So proportionality of the cost, as the whole purpose of the multiple cost objective is that the cost is proportionately allocated to each of the funding sources. If the employees works on multiple objectives, their salary and associated costs should be proportionately allocated based on the time they spent on each activity. For example, if 60%.
Roger,
Yes, sir.
Roger.
I think the slides got knocked off. I
Okay.
just see you and not the
I'm
presentation.
sorry, let me just go.
Oh, that's okay. Must have
Yeah.
somehow got clicked off. And one funny thing while you're doing that, if you're hearing some music around here, I had to move out of that other room
Okay.
and into the kind of the lobby area. So I'm not having a party right now.
Okay.
Even though I could would love to have a margarita at the time.
Can you all see the slides? And I'm going to,
Yeah, if you take it all the way to that
yeah,
slide
and
that you have, then you can put it back into the
yeah, there you
presentation.
go. Sorry about that. I think this is where
Not a
I
problem.
was, right? From
Uh,
the,
yeah,
okay.
I think you were there.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, I had somebody come into the room trying to set up some food and drinks, and I'm like, I told them, please let me finish my presentation. The room is all yours then.
We've had some kind of technical difficulties this morning. Didn't have the room secured, and now they're trying to use that same room to prep for the luncheon that we're having. So you may hear some plates clanging around when Roger's finishing for today, but we'll have it all set.
Hopefully.
I'm on mute now.
All right. Thank you, Mark. I was giving you an example of 60% of the time is spent on one cost objective and another on 40% on another, then the cost should be divided accordingly. The certification, again, all time and efforts need to be certified, whether it's monthly, quarterly, semi-annually. So the timesheet should be certified by the employee. Again, either the supervisor who has the first-hand knowledge of the work performed. This certification verifies that the time recorded accurately reflect the work done on each grant or cost objective. So we now have the time and effort that is certified that basically allocates the cost to each funding source. This sounds a little complicated, but it's really not. We can keep it really, really simple. Basically, if you have a timesheet or a time log that the number of hours that you're working on, if you can also describe the tasks that you worked on those hours, like for instance, somebody's working 5 hours on a grant management and 5 hours on some other task. If you can just go ahead and I worked 5 hours on a grant management. Now you can have a legend. You don't have to really describe a lot of activities into this. What do you do for the grant management? That's where I can go into your job description and look at all the activities you're required to have. But you can have just a GM for grant manager or CL for services. So if you go into your time and effort, and if you have electronic or if you have still on the paper, you could just jot down like I work 4 hours on CL or 4 hours on the GM. That way, when you add up your hours at the end of the day or the end of the month, it will translate into the percentages of time you spent on that particular project. So the project could be, you may have 2 or 3 different projects or grant that you're working on, but then within those projects, you can describe your activities as grant management or client services or something like that. Like I said, you can create your own legend as long as you have them once again, neatly defined in your policies and procedures for the time and effort. That way, the staff knows, and if they change, you change your legends, then you can change those as well, and the staff needs to be informed about the changes. If you add some other additional responsibilities, they can go ahead and select from that. So it's really not that difficult. And again, a lot of agencies will accept different things, but I'm just telling you these are the basic rules that basically you need to be able to show you worked on the project. When did you work on a project, or at least how many hours did you work on the project? Because at the end of the month, they need to come up with the percentage of the time you spent on that particular project, so that way you can get paid accordingly. So, as I mentioned earlier, time and effort has to be reconciled with the payroll. Everybody who is going to have a time and effort, their payroll is initially budgeted based on whatever the percentage they think that employee will be working on that particular program. I really would discourage you to kind of set the budget based on the funding source. It should be based on how much time the employee would spend on that particular grant to meet the objective of the program. Just because you have certain amount of money, let me just pay somebody 30% or 40% of this federal program. And if they are not able to carry out the activities for that program, then that's going to defeat the whole purpose of the time and effort, and you will not be able to match the time and effort with the actual amount of payroll cost. So you can have the payroll budgets, initially you can have the budget cost, and you can estimate the amount for the support of one or more cost objective. Um, but on a quarterly basis, you should compare their time and effort with the actual payroll cost. What was their budgeted payroll cost? So if there is a difference of 10% or more between the actual payroll cost and what they reported on their time and effort, then you should take the one of these following action. You should go and adjust your payroll records to match their time and effort. So let's see if the employee was supposed to was budgeted at 30%, but they ended up spending only 10% on the program on a monthly basis. After 3 months on a quarterly basis, when you look at their payroll, they've gotten paid at the rate of 30% from that particular grant, but they've only worked 10% on that program. This is where you really need to make an adjustment and adjust their payroll internally. I'm not saying they've already gotten their paycheck. So what you need to do is internally change your budgets. So now that you're only allocating that 10% of the cost which they work based on their time effort, instead of the 30% of the cost that they were regularly getting paid. Not only that, you will also make sure that going forward, you will change their payroll allocations to 10% instead of 30%, because now you know that they're actually working only 10%. And this could be other way around too. They were budgeted 30%, but you ended up but they ended up working 50% of the time, which means that now you need to make sure that their budget should be changed to 50%, because they're working 50% of the time for the time and effort. If the difference is less than 10%, like I said, this requires time, your accountants to go change your budgets and move the money around. If it is less than 10%, then you can do this process annually. You can wait till the end of the year and move your budgets to make sure that it matches what they have reported on the time and effort. At the end of the year, all necessary adjustments must be made such that the final amount charged to the federal award is reconciled with the time and effort records. At the end of the year, everything needs to match based on their time and effort. This is when the employees are actually reporting their time and effort on a monthly basis. So it's really important that at the end of the year, everything matches. And you don't have to go, like I said, make these changes if it is less than 10%. So the reconciliation is extremely important. And without that, there is no time and effort. There is no point of maintaining time and effort, because you could just have your budgeted amount. Folks can get paid based on their budgeted amount, and nobody is looking at their actual time and effort. So it's really important that folks report their time and effort based on the projects they work on, and that they are reconciled with the payroll cost. Let's talk about the incentives. A few years ago, nobody really thought that the incentives were part of the time and effort, because there is no time involved here. But as long as the time, if there is as long as there is any type of compensation, it includes incentives, bonuses, or anything, whichever is allowed per particular grant, then they need to have some type of a time and effort reported with them. There are some grants, like specifically ARP-SA, that allows incentives for all the employees. Not all the grants allow these incentives, but if they are, then there should be a time and effort that should be reported with these grants. So this is a little bit different than your regular certifications, in the sense that there is time associated with them. Here, what we require, that the incentives for the time and effort, that they should have policies and procedures for incentive that must be explicitly approved and aligned with the organization policies and procedures. There should be justification provided for the cost, demonstrating how it contributes contributes to achieving the program's goals and why incentives are necessary. The federal government still wants to know you're paying this federal money on what basis. That's where the policies come in, and this is where the justification comes in. Now, certain grants, they allow incentives like ARPA to all the staff members, regardless of which grant they worked on for the program. So again, that needs to be specified in that policies and procedure. They should also include the criteria for the eligibility to receive incentive. That would be a criteria that the employees are paid incentives because the grant allows the grantee, the staff, to have these retention incentives or something like that. Whatever the incentives are approved, there are different types of incentives that are approved from different grants. It's As far as the documentation is concerned, so we have two things. We have your policies and procedures that define why the incentives are paid, and it should be approved and be part of your policies and procedures. And the second thing is a documentation that will list the employees who are paid incentives, certified by the supervisor, confirming that the recipients met the criteria and in accordance with the approved policy. So you have the policy that says this is the reason we are paying them these incentive, and then you have a document that certifies that all these employees who received the incentives met this eligible criteria. So if you have those two things, that pretty much covers the time and effort. I've seen more and more folks using the electronic reporting of time and effort. Some of them are really easy to use, some of them are. There's always a cost associated with them. So each grantee has to make its own decision whether they are able to incorporate the time and effort into the automated system. The only reason you would consider that is because it can track time, activities, and the cost allocation across multiple projects. So it's very easy when you go into the software and say, on this project, I worked 4 hours and this, and that at the end, it automatically calculates how much percentage of time you spent on each of those projects. So it really is helpful when you are trying to do specifically the multiple cost objective activities. And so they can really simplify the process and reduce the risk of errors. When you have those, you want to make sure that you implement good security measures to protect their sensitive time and effort data from unauthorized accesses such as encryption, access control, and authentication protocols. You want to make sure that only the employee is able to get in there, report their time, or their supervisors is going into there and certifying their time that's reported on the time and effort. Again, just like you had to provide a lot of training on the policies and procedures, you need to provide training on the electronic system, because if they are not using it correctly, and then they may have some errors, And so definitely you want to make sure that they are provided adequate training to use that system. Sometimes some of these softwares can actually integrate your electronic system with the payroll accounting system. So literally they are matching what the employee reported, what the budgets are. And so that can also minimize it can streamline the process and minimize the errors. So I highly recommend it. If you have an option, or if you can get an electronic system, it will make the time and effort much, much, much more easier. So these are some of the problems that I have personally seen in my last 25 years of working with the payroll cost, and that, related to the time and effort. Number one, just not reporting time and effort. You're just getting paid out of the federal funds. There's no time and effort ever reported. Simple timesheet sometime will not work, and just reporting hours, and especially if you're working on multiple cost objectives, you did not report how much time you spent on the project, and so that could create a problem. And and the big problem is when you don't prepare these reports on a timely manner, you can't go back 6 months to a year to see what you did. If you are worked on 100%, if you're paid 100% from the grant or worked on a single objective, it's a little bit easier. You can go back and create a semi-annual certification or any type of certification that basically certifies that you spend 100% of your effort on this grant. But if you were to, if you're paid from multiple funding sources, you have to report multiple activities for those for those sources. It becomes really hard for somebody to go back 6 months or 4 months to see what they did during the month for those funding sources. So it's really important that you have good time and effort, at least, that can provide a reasonable assurances that you are allocating the cost to the right funding sources. They are not certified. The time and effort documentation was not certified the employee or an official having a first-hand knowledge of the work performed. I've seen folks, literally as soon as the time and effort reporting period begins, that they sign off on it like I'm done. No, it's always after the fact. You have to first show that you worked on the project and then only you sign the certification. Paying employees based on the budget, not effort. Federal grant rules require employees to be reimbursed based on the factual recorded effort on the grant, not merely budgeted amount. And so once you set up the budget and then nobody's looking at the time and effort, nobody's either not maintaining or not adequately maintaining, or even if they are maintaining, somebody's not looking at time and effort and comparing with the employee's payroll costs, and they are just getting paid based on whatever initially the budget was set up, that could be a problematic because again, you didn't pay them according to what they put their effort on the grant. They just basically got paid based on the budget. Certifying time and effort before the work is performed. Basically, as I mentioned it earlier, if the reporting period ends on the August and if somebody signs it on before at the August 31st, and if somebody signs an effort on the 28th, well, what happened to the rest of the days? So it's really important that the work is completed after um, the reporting period is ended. Here again, the time and effort documentation for personnel paid with grant funds did not account for the total activity for which the employees were compensated. So I've seen this many times. I would get a time and effort just for the part where they worked on the federal grant and not on anything else that they worked on. So it's not giving me the full picture of what percentage of their total time they worked on the activity. Instead of 40 hours, they'll just send like 20 hours that they worked on their grant and they will submit the time and effort for that. No, the time and effort is not a 40-hour work week. It's the 100% of your effort throughout the week. Even if you work on the weekend, it doesn't matter. If you're showing that this is my effort, then it needs to be based on that. Payroll costs are not reconciled with the time and effort reporting documentation. Again, we talked about it. It's really important. If you report the effort, you need to reconcile with your payroll costs. Time and effort documentation not maintained for supplemental income such as incentives. So we just talked about it, how even if you have incentives, you still need to come up with the time and effort by preparing a policy and also creating a list of the staff members who received these incentives and why they were eligible to receive those incentives. Lack of policy justifying supplemental payments. Policy is really important. If you don't have a policy, sometimes they will deny all the incentives, can become a question cause, so it's really important that you have that policy in place. Not appreciating the scope of the False Claims Act. Incorrectly charging time to federal award means that you are making a false claim against the government, which can result in a question cost as well as the suspension of the grant. Now, this is to the really extreme end, but it has happened where the federal government has gone after the grantees or subrecipients and claim that, hey, you incorrectly charge us this money. You knew this employee or you did not care that the employee reported correct time and effort, and you claimed all this reimbursement based on that. So that could have a really serious serious effect on it. So again, this is something that's part of the law. So I just thought that I'll bring it up. So the discussion question we have, are the contractors or consultants working on the federal program are required to report time and effort? The answer is contractors or consultants are paid according to the terms and condition of their respective contract with the grantee. They're not paid according to the time. You give them a contract and you to give them the deliverables. So they are going to work on the deliverables, such as, preparing reports or counseling sessions or anything that's agreed upon in their contract. So they are getting paid on that. They're not getting paid. They're not your kind of grantee, so they are not required to maintain their time and effort. So yeah, no, any of the contractors that are working with you are not required to maintain the time and effort. And that pretty much brings up to my end of my presentation. Mark, are you still there?
Yes, I'm just coming on board now.
Okay.
I'll leave my video off since I'm in
Okay.
kind of a hallway, people going back and forth.
Okay, let me see if we have anything in the chat.
Yeah, do we have any questions? Because we can answer those now at this point. I do want to say a couple of things on that incentive programs that were out there. On the ARP, that was American Rescue Plan Act that was done for the pandemic. And that was the only reason that they came up with the incentives. They wanted to keep staff available through the pandemic. And so the feds did that. That's the one reason that the grants had that. Most grants do not have that. And in this specific type of grant with the ARP, it did allow for all employees, even if you weren't on the grant, like Roger was talking about, that could have some incentive. And it was just to keep people working during the pandemic. ARP is going away in the next year. It was I think a 3-year situation or grant. And Peggy, can you kind of explain that a little bit? I think you know more about the ARP end dates and everything else, because I don't want people to be confused with, oh, well, there's a new thing coming up. This was very specific to the pandemic.
Right. So the ARPA funds end September 2025. That makes sense.
Okay, so it's coming to an end pretty soon in that situation. Any other things that we have for questions? I can look at that. Oh, here it is. For the 10% variance, one of the things that auditors will do is that typically when you do your time and effort reports, you're doing it within the actual time, and specifically for the type of grants that y'all are involved in that we administer, you never know who's going to come in and when. So you may have, if you're split funded, you may have services, let's say an example of family violence and sexual assault. Well, whoever comes in that 1 week that you're logging in things, you may have more than in one area than you do another for your funding. And auditors will understand that there's going to be some variance behind that. And that's why it's usually, the standard is anything that's 10% or less is not considered significant in that situation. Now, if it's consistently 10% or more, then you really need to do your budget adjustments to reflect what your time and effort is. The biggest part about time and effort is that's where 80 to 90% of your grant is. And that's where we've seen programs having to pay back a lot more money, because any error in the time and effort reporting reflects on question cost in that situation. Does that kind of answer the question, Roger?
Yeah, I think
that
so. And
about right?
it's also part of the 2 CFR 200, but it
Mhm.
doesn't go into like quarterly and all that. The reason we say that quarterly because it's easier for if you have more than 10%, then it becomes very harder at the end of the year to adjust the budgets and all that. So if you're reviewing it on a quarterly basis, the 2 CFR 200 says that you should be reviewing these, on a periodic basis to make sure that you make the adjustments to reflect the actual payroll cost or the time and effort matching the payroll cost. So I think the quarterly is a good, that way you're not doing this monthly. But anytime, if you feel like your time and effort is not going to match with your payroll costs, you should be looking at them. You should be reconciling. The reason we put quarterly because it's kind of gives you enough time to go back and adjust your budgets and all that.
Another thing with quarterly, depending on the agency that's funding you, sometimes like VOCA may look in their audits that they may go back a whole year within that year and looking at all of your time and effort reports in one sense. And that could be significant of a change where some others like we do, we will test 1 month or a quarter, depending on what we're doing at the time. And some other agencies will do that. What happens with the quarter, with the month, is that 1 month can be much more different than other months. And it's always good to, if you're being audited in that kind of situation, is to be prepared and have a time study analysis of a quarter. We call it quarter because it's 3 months. And typically within those 3 months, those particular hours will even out in 3 months than it would be with testing just 1 month of timesheets in that situation. That's what I think is very helpful. And like Roger was saying, that's another good management tool. If you're reconciling quarterly, then you know, oh, we're either not going to have enough money to charge off because we're overcharging in one point, we need to do a budget adjustment or so. That's a good reason for
And I
doing
think you
those
brought up
things.
you brought up a very good point, Mark, because they fluctuate a lot. Like 1 month
They
you may
do.
work 20%, the other month. So 3 months is a good time to see where exactly you're averaging it. Again, we have to look at the time. So if you're averaging it out, then it's fine. If it's less than 10%, you don't have to worry about it. If it's only 10% more, then I think you need to take some action. Yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of times
Yeah.
there are some months like there's the Sexual Assault Awareness Month, there's a Family Violence Awareness Month. And when you have staff that are split funded like that, well, naturally in 1 month, you might have more outreach or other things that you're doing in one fund compared to another. And that's a good reason to have that kind of time study to even out those things at the same time. When you're signing your awards, as we call it, the certification part, that's critical in that situation. The new, like Roger was saying, the new 2 CFR doesn't give you all those directions like the old cost principles did, where it's supposed to be signed by the employee and the supervisor that has direct knowledge in one sense. Those are best practices, and that's part of the internal controls that they've done. So they've brought up internal control from just the audit circular up to now all of the policies and procedures. And now auditors have to go and look at your policies and procedures to make sure that your time and effort and everything fits into a good internal controls, which are your best practices. So those things that you need to look at. But when you're signing those things, both employee and the supervisor should realize, and I'll be talking about this in the policies and procedures area, that when you sign a document like that, even though it's your own document, it's for the feds or the state, because you're certifying that those things are reasonably accurate and complete. And by signing it, you're certifying that. And I know from past experiences where I've seen audits that turns into fraud because people were frauding the government with their timesheets, that the severity of that is you could actually be sued by the government for falsifying a government document. And those can kind of become pretty severe. Don't see that very often, but I have seen that in other grants from other agencies where people actually just falsified their time and effort. They didn't do any work in any of that stuff, and they, oh, by the way, they actually had a business at the same time, so they were supplementing their business by falsifying government documents, and that's fraud, which is another big part of the 2 CFR. So, you know, we always talk about being careful of what you sign. Just as long as you are reasonably given reasonable assurance that things are accurate and correct is kind of the threshold. Any other questions that you may have? You can just type it in. If not, we will have this recorded.
Mark, I do have one or
Yeah.
more to one slide. Here's our technical assistance. So
Okay.
we do provide ongoing support and technical assistance regarding the fiscal compliance. We strongly encourage you to reach out to either me or Mark. You know, Mark is online right now or with us, so he can answer a lot of your questions, or I'm always available to answer a lot of your questions. Time and effort is, again, like 80% of your grant goes to the payroll cost, at least most of the ones that I look at it. So it's really, I strongly urge you to look at your time and effort documentation, how you're preparing, whether you have policies and procedures or not. And if you have any questions, because we monitor or we review the current year grant, so that we can fix everything. We can go back and you know, if there is something missing, we can advise you or guide you to fix your time and effort. Once the fiscal year ends, we go into the new year, and if you're audited at that time, there's not a whole lot we can do to go back a year when your books have been closed and all that. So it's always a good idea to take advantage of the technical assistance, or if you have any questions, you know, just it's a good idea to kind of have a good time and effort records to, like I said, is most of your costs is associated with the payroll cost. And I think the last thing we have is our SurveyMonkey, which I think Peggy's gonna put a link on our chat. So you can either scan this or you can either have this link. And I think we will also have a link in our chat, so you can go ahead and give us a survey and how we can improve our presentations or the content to serve you better.
While we're doing that, we have the training this afternoon, which will be cost allocation. We do have training tomorrow, which is the preferred policies and procedures, part 1 and part 2. So that'll be in the morning and the afternoon. Also, what I would like to let people know at this time is that the 2 CFR has been updated, and for all the federal agencies, they are required to implement that by October 1 of this year. There's some changes in there. There's some that are significant. I've been going through a lot of that so that hopefully by mid-September or somewhere around there, we will be doing another webinar just on the significant changes into the 2 CFR, so y'all will know what compliances that are coming through. One I can tell you very quickly is that on the audit feature, if you have over $750,000 of federal expenses from awards, you're required to have a single audit. After October 1st, any grants and contracts that are initiated at that time, the new threshold will be $1 million. So a lot of people will be not having to do single audits at that point because it's increased quite a bit. There's some increases in the procurement and everything, but we will let y'all know at that time. We will be sending you an email out and then scheduling that. So that's something to think about in the near future. Those are starting again October 1. I just think it's odd that they put those things in that time frame. I can understand for October 1 because that's a federal cycle for grants in that situation. The original 2 CFR came out in December 24th. It was really kind of funny, 2014, which was an odd timeline. And it is now 10 years that we've been in the area of the 2 CFR. So everybody should be pretty much attuned to that, but we do provide those kind of services. Again, if you have any kind of questions or need technical assistance, that's what my job is. And Roger helps me with the technical assistance at the same time in that. Any other questions? I think we don't have any questions, so we could probably just end today and we will see people. Go ahead.
Mark, I just want to say that I put the link to the evaluation in
I
the
saw-
chat.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, I see that. Thank you.
Thank you, Peggy.
Yes. Yeah, so there we go. Hopefully everybody got the presentation handouts before time. If not, just email me and I will take care of those things at the same time. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
It's saying the SurveyMonkey is not showing the correct workshop. Maybe is that the one? Just use the link from the chat. I think that would be better.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sounds good.
Can you stop the
Okay.
recording, Roger?
Yeah.
I can.
Yeah.
Forgot.
Okay, they're saying the link from the chat is not working, so.
So